Absolutely.
Okay, recording. All right. Hello and welcome to the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interview series with prominent authors and historians specializing in the colonial period and revolutionary America. My name is Christian DiSpigna, and today we are delighted to be joined by our guest host, J.L. Bell, author of The Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, and also the creator of the popular blog Boston 1775. The Boston Massacre remains one of the most iconic events in early American history, and this year marks its 250th anniversary. Today, we explore the pivotal event through the eyes of a distinguished scholar and historian whose research took a unique and fascinating new approach. And JL, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christian. Serena Zabin is a professor of history and the director of American Studies at Carleton College. Her books include Dangerous Economies, Status and Commerce in Imperial New York, and The Boston Massacre, A Family History. In addition to her teaching and research, Serena is also the co-designer of a forthcoming video game about the Boston Massacre, Witness to the Revolution. Serena, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And let's begin with this question. Your book takes a new slant on the old story of the Boston Massacre. So how did you start out thinking about that historic event, and what sent you along a new path?
Well, I came across the story really because I happened over a mention of a soldier's wife who was talking with Bostonians a few days before the Boston Massacre. This is, and this conversation is recorded in a pretty famous pamphlet that was published just a few weeks after the shooting. It's not an obscure document. It's excerpted, I'd say, in most textbooks. But even after I'd been teaching this pamphlet for years, I really hadn't noticed until recently, or up until that moment, that it was actually just chock full of references to soldiers' wives. And then I started thinking about it and I thought, I don't know anything about these women. I actually didn't even really realize that soldiers could be married. And so then that finally led me on this question, like, who were these soldiers' wives? Should start there. Who were they? And what were they doing in Bostonians' houses talking with them? And that is what started me off. And so then as I learned more about these soldiers and their families, their stories really just sparked my imagination about what it would be like to travel around the empire and try to raise a family in those kinds of situations. So as I started to learn more about these women and these families, I thought, most Americans, including honestly most historians, we think that we know all there is to know about the Boston Massacre. But once I started to see this new part of the story, and really I kind of fell in love with a lot of these families and their children, I saw that this was really a human story, and it wasn't just a political and military story of the Boston Massacre. And so once I saw that, I just knew I had to tell the story. I was so excited about it.
That's great. Now that pamphlet was probably the short narrative
It
of the
absolutely
horrid
was
massacre
the short
from Boston.
narrative.
And since this is the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society, we should credit him as a co-author of that pamphlet. Christian?
Yeah, and Serena, I just wanted to mention that I first heard about you and your work through John, because he had attended, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, you had attended an event at MHS, and it was a panel discussion, and you were discussing your research. And from that moment on, I couldn't wait to get my hands on your book when it first came out. But one of the questions—
Many years.
Right.
It was a long research process.
How long was it, just out of curiosity?
Honestly, I think it was about a decade. My New York book came out in 2009, and this came out in 2020, and I didn't take a big break in between them.
Right.
But there's nothing like a historic anniversary to give you a deadline.
That is so true. At the end, I was pushing really hard. I could have kept going. There was so much more to learn.
And that was one of the other things I was curious about. They obviously, the publisher timed it so it would be near the actual.
Okay, to be completely honest, we had hoped that I would finish it almost a year earlier. And I just kept going and I kept rewriting, and I really wanted to tell the story in a way that people wanted to read. And, and I love good prose, but it doesn't just flow out of me like water. It really took some work. So I would say that really we made a virtue out of my slowness. It was originally intended for a different date.
Well, it was worth it. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was, is there anything that was really surprising to you when you were doing your research?
Well, I think the thing that surprised me the most really is that nobody seemed to have ever told this story before, right? I know we don't have a lot of sources from the 18th century, of course, and we have very little, as we all know, about people who aren't big writers who tend to essentially be white political men. Right. So, of course, we don't have a lot that these people wrote, but it was amazing to me once I started looking how much evidence there was about these families, about their lives, about the connections that soldiers made with civilians. And so at some point, I started to feel like the story was just lying there on the streets of Boston, just waiting for me to pick it up. And it did surprise me that nobody had told that story before.
I think what surprised me when I first started reading your book was that it didn't start on the streets of Boston. It really, I mean, the beginning was starting in Ireland, an area
Yeah.
which really, I mean, that was such a treat, but you really did a deep dive. So that I thought that was great.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I thought it was really important that people understood that this is a story of the British Empire. It's a story of the British Atlantic, right? It doesn't just sort of start on the Shawmut Peninsula, right?
Right.
And that these people have lives that started in other places, and that we really can only understand what happened in Boston if we pay attention to Boston as part of a larger empire. And I also did, as a writing piece, wanted to disrupt a little bit people's ideas about what the Boston Massacre was. So I thought, well, I'm not going to start with, John Adams, right? Or even with Captain Preston. I'm going to start with a woman that no one's ever heard of and a place that no one's ever thought about as related to the Boston Massacre, just to try to upend our expectations a little bit.
Are there aspects, you've talked about what's new and unique about this take, what we shouldn't leave out of future histories. Are there aspects that you think may have been overemphasized or that have gotten their due already and we don't need to hear from again?
Well, let's see. There's probably a couple. I would say the biggest one is this idea that there were these inevitable rising tensions between soldiers and civilians, this sort of drumbeat of hostility that sort of kept growing and growing and growing until finally it inevitably ended up with, you know, gunfire, right? As though somehow, I don't know, this was like the, OK Corral or something that happened in the middle of Boston. And that's not what this story is at all. There's nothing inevitable about that shooting, although there was something very probable about it, as everybody knew.
Yeah, everybody talked about, I mean, the Boston Whigs, it was part of their ideology that putting the soldiers there would lead to this inevitably. And
Right.
for the London, the government, this just showed what they thought about Boston being riotous to begin with. So we haven't heard, as you say, this counter narrative of people from different parts of the British Empire actually becoming a society in some way.
Right, right. Becoming neighbors. I mean, for me, that was the most exciting part that even now, years after I started figuring this out, I kind of get goosebumps when I think about what it took to really figure out and to start to see, oh, these are people who truly are neighbors and all the ways in which we think about that, right? And in the same ways that, we're talking a lot about neighbors right now, right? People with competing political signs on their yards, right? And who are there's lots of neighbors who don't get along, right? But nonetheless, they're living side by side. And there are other moments when, they have a completely normal human relationships with each other, right? Where they're borrowing stuff from each other and their kids are running out of each other's houses and all of those things. That's the world of occupied Boston.
And picking up on that, given it's the 250th, do you think that the massacre has any relevance to today?
Oh, that's a great question. I I do. I think that what that shooting and the politicization that happens to it afterwards really can show us is that we can lose so easily the sense of what it means to be neighbors, what it means to be connected with each other. We are in, of course, we're in the middle of an incredibly heated election, right? And so it's not surprising that we're in a very partisan moment, but we have been, even before, the election season officially started, we've been in a pretty partisan moment where a lot of people, a lot of pundits are complaining about the divisions of our nation. And I think that those are sometimes a little bit produced, right, by a kind of chattering political class, which Paul Revere was a part of, with that, big engraving where he's trying to show this division between soldiers and civilians. And likewise, I think that really there's a lot more connection between people if we remember to look for it.
Okay. Can you tell us about a particularly moving or emotional experience or few that you had while writing this book? What really touched you as a person?
So I think the person that stuck with me the most, that really touched me, is the woman I open with, is Jane Chambers. Partly because she was my thread through so much of the story. I couldn't believe that I was actually able to follow this woman, who really was essentially unknown, who never did any politically important thing in her life, over, three spaces, couple continents over the Atlantic. So my ability to trace her was very meaningful, but really, I became, I guess I was just deeply impressed by her commitment to keeping her family together. It was not easy for her as she moved and was moved by the British Army from place to place with her children, several of whom at least, did not survive this experience. And so at one point, I was in the Boston Public Library when it was open, and looking at receipts from the selectmen, and they had paid the town sexton to bury a soldier's child. And I could put that together with some other evidence I had that she and her child had been sent out to a kind of quarantine space in Boston Harbor, and that she had returned alone, and that this receipt was for the burial of her child, who was never named. And I found that so moving. I actually literally cried upstairs in the BPL, like tears came to my eyes. And I thought, okay, this is all we have for this poor child and this poor mother.
Mm-hmm. Who has been left on Boston soil,
Yeah,
even as the rest of the family moved on.
exactly.
Mm.
Yeah, just left out there in the harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very sad.
I think there's sometimes a misconception that people back in the 18th century, because there was such a higher rate of infant mortality, were somehow more inured to the emotional pangs when a child would die. And I don't think anything could be further from the truth.
No, not at all. I mean, the other piece that really moved me um, were a collection of letters that were written by a woman who was actually traveling with a different regiment, not one of the regiments that ended up in Boston, but one that ended up in North America at the same time. She was married to a doctor in the army, and she left behind both her children and her parents when she went. And every single letter is just suffused with her anxiety about what's happened to the family that she's left behind. And every letter that she receives from home, she writes about her fear of opening it, for fear that it will tell her about the death of her family. And indeed, both her newborn child and her mother die while she is gone. And she is really pretty unmoored by those deaths.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I wonder, you might have answered it, but I was going to ask if there was another character in the story who stayed with you other than.
I mean, yeah. So So the other thing I have to say I just loved about this book is that some of it was fun, right? A lot of it was fun. I mean, it's intellectually fun to put these pieces together, but I also met people that I thought were really very, very funny. And honestly, my favorite one, and I know, John, you like to write about him too, is a private named William Clark, right? Who's just such a cad, but I expect so charming, right? So he writes this play in Boston that he calls The Miser, right? Or Soldier's Humor, whatever in the world he thinks, I don't know who he thinks is going to go to this play. But then he ends up actually going to bed with and then eventually kind of marrying the granddaughter of a son of liberty. He's found in bed by the grandfather. He refuses to leave. He, attempts to shoot or threatens to shoot his father-in-law. He ends up in jail with Preston and the other soldiers. And then he writes a tell-all memoir when he leaves Boston. We don't know if it was ever published, but it's pretty fabulous. And in the title, I mean, it's such a tell-all that he really gives the address of his in-laws whom he's out to get with this memoir. And I found him hilarious. I really enjoyed that.
That's good comic relief for the
we all need some comic relief sometimes.
Let's talk a little bit about your sources and the research that you put into this book. I remember years ago seeing the marriage record of Private James Hartigan, who ends up as one of the massacre defendants. And that one's nicely labeled with his regiment.
Right.
But as I understand it from you, most of the marriage records you found don't come packaged so easily. So
they don't.
What did you do? What was the research like?
I too found some of these marriages sort of right off, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. And then I started coming across some, kind of fairly unique names. I mean, a guy whose name is Popplewhite, a guy whose name is Joseph Laugh, right? Who show up in some of the other published records we know are soldiers, and then they show up in Boston records without an indication that they're soldiers. And I started to wonder, what does that mean, right? And how will I find the soldiers? So what I ended up doing was going to London and creating an enormous database of all of the soldiers who were in the 4 regiments who came to Boston. So the 14th, the 29th, the 64th, and the 65th. And once I had all of their names and everything we knew about when they deserted or died, when they came, when they were transferred out, then I could cross-reference all of those names against all these court records, against all these marriage records, baptism records, some death records. It was kind of tedious, but it was also really kind of fun. And then the other set of records, I should say, that I added into this database were the warning out records. So the town of Boston actually hired a man, and there's a wonderful, wonderful book by Nina Dayton, Sharon Salinger about this. But they hired a man to walk around the town of Boston and remind newcomers that if they need financial support, if they need welfare at any point, the town of Boston is not obligated to give it to them. Right? They're not native Bostonians, and so they're not really entitled to welfare. And the man who does this in the late 1760s is a really meticulous note taker. So he explains exactly who he talked to and where they're living. And that was incredibly helpful for figuring out where there were soldiers and what their names were and who were their landlords, how many kids they had. And so when all that went into the database, that really helped clarify some of these marriages and some of these baptisms. I mean, there are at least 10 soldiers named John Brown. And if any of them got married in Boston, I didn't count them. If I couldn't actually trace a name like that back, or once I could trace a name like that back to a Massachusetts baptismal record, I didn't count it as a marriage. It may have been, but I think the number of marriages I found are probably an undercount because I was very conservative.
Mm-hmm. And what about researching non-elite women? What were the special challenges there, and what did you find?
I I looked in places that we don't often look for women's stories. So a big piece of that really were military records, right? So, and especially receipts. So looking at the number of excuse me, I lost the word, the number of rations that the Army was, handing out at any given moment, especially for travel, when one compares that against the size of the company that the rations are supposed to be for, you can start to figure out, okay, how many more women, how many more children are they bringing here, right? They only got half or quarter rations, so there's a few more than that. So that was one piece. The kind of mother lode for me really was the naval records that list the names of every woman who travels on an HMS, ship, any ship from the Navy that is carting the Army around the British Empire, listed the names of every single person, or every single person over the age of 16, I think, that ship carried. And so
Hmm.
I could see the names of every woman who came from Ireland or England.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that was great.
Um, one of the things that a lot of historians have said about the conflict in Boston was that locals were upset that the soldiers were competing for their jobs, and this is an economic motivation, a working class motivation for the enmity
Right.
with the soldiers. And I've heard you say some interesting things about that.
Yes. So this story about moonlighting soldiers, right, who undercut local working class Bostonians, right, for day labor, especially, um, as a cause of the conflict between soldiers and working class men is, I'd say, at the core of the story that we've been telling about, or part of that story that we've been telling really for the last 50 or 60 years, right? Which is that story of economic conflict. Um, when I went digging to figure out where that idea came from, I found a couple of things. And the first thing I found was that it was based on a claim by Richard Morris that he wrote in, I think it was called Law in Early America, maybe one of his major tomes in the 30s, if I remember correctly, which has no footnote. He just said it. And after that, every single person just kept citing him until actually Jesse Lemish said it. And then everybody just cited Jesse Lemish. So once I went back through the footnotes, like in any good grad student way, I was like, oh, there's not actually any proof for this. Right. So then I started wondering, well, I wonder what kind of proof there would be. And maybe he knew something and he just didn't write it down. And this all I didn't put into the book. That was, it became a little too academic, but it was a lot of fun. Partly because you, John, helped me think, okay, we can know something about wages, right? Because you pointed me towards some account books where people talked a little bit about what they were paying, although it's pretty hard to figure out day wages for
Yeah.
any given job from those. And I did find some evidence, especially in Canada, that when they were in Nova Scotia, that soldiers did occasionally hire themselves out, especially to bring in the harvest, right? That was
Hmm.
appreciated. Um, and that sometimes local officials approached a commanding officer and asked essentially for a team of guys to do something like road work, right? Where they would pay them pretty much the going rate. But actually, there's some pretty clear instructions from generals on down saying, you know what, actually, men need to be paid at something pretty close to the going rate, right? You can't exploit them for this. Their first job is to work for the Army. They can only take on this other stuff when there's not work for them to do. You can't just hire them out. But they were paid in lots of ways. I mean, so if you're a tailor, for example, the Army would pay you to also work on uniforms, right, for the Army, even as you are also being paid to be a soldier, right? And the Army's always trying to cut their expenses, but there but that rate is not particularly under the going rate, right? So it was hard to figure exactly, and I didn't want to argue it too strongly, but the idea that men would work for nothing, right, or would work for so little that they would undercut, local men, and that, local employers were looking to save so much that they would rather hire these men than people with whom they've had some experience. There just was no evidence to that, right? If somebody came out and said, actually, I found the account book and it's true, right?
Mm-hmm.
Soldiers will only work they're willing to work for 3 pence a day and everybody else is charging 5. I'd say, well, that's, who knew? And I don't think there's any evidence that says that's completely impossible, but it's very, very unlikely.
And it wasn't something people were complaining about at the time.
No, there's no complaints about that at the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Okay. Well, are there, when you look at the Boston Massacre now and everything around, are there big mysteries that you think are still out there to be delved into the way you delved into the question of the soldiers' families and the soldiers' familial connections with
You mean when it
Bostonians?
comes to what it is that a historian could still ask?
Yes, or what it is that because of the 250th anniversary deadline that you weren't able to go down that rabbit hole as far as you wanted to go.
Oh my gosh. I mean, there are so many rabbit holes that I would have loved to have gone down. I mean, every single one of these marriages, I really just am dying to know what happened. A few of them I do know, there's a couple of people who successfully managed to even purchase land in England, which is not an easy thing to do, right? So a couple of people
Mm-hmm.
really succeed. A couple of people lose the child that they had in Boston. I learned that part. One of my favorites is really that one of the Flucker girls, who's one of the more elite women who marries an officer, ends up in this fairly scandalous divorce in Scotland, where there's accusations that she's having an affair with a different soldier, a different officer. That's a story I would love to tell. Its relevance to the Boston Massacre was perhaps thin enough that I decided that I should wait, but I did manage to get hold of the divorce records, so I'm looking forward to doing that one. So those pieces are
Excellent.
there. I mean, what we don't know, and I don't think we ever will, is actually, you know, who, and I think that could be a plural, who actually yelled fire that night, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
did that, is there still a question of who started it? I mean, I don't think that's the most helpful question for us to think about historically, but is that something that we're all and will always be curious about? Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think that's about the time we have for today's interview with Serena Zabin, author of The Boston Massacre, A Family History. Serena, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge, and we hope you'll come back.
I would love to. Thank you so much for a great conversation.
And I just wanted to add that, as far as colonial Boston history, I don't know of anyone doing the research better than you and J.L. Bell. I mean, really, you both do deep dives. It's original research. It's refreshing. It's illuminated me. I know I personally relied on J.L. Bell when I was writing my own book. And so I feel I'm in the presence of two titans here. So
I know. John, I hope you noticed I cite you for, it's John Moyes, right? Like your story on John Moyes, whom I should have mentioned in this, more largely, but also, was part of what intrigued me so much, because that was the only connection really to my first book, right? Which was the story of the informal economy. How is it that goods are circulating in this, mostly illegal, but not completely illegal way, right? Like, and especially clothing, that people have very, have really varied ideas about clothing. Is it yours when you wear it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, does it still belong to the person who gave it to you to wear as a temporary thing? And, so that story about John Moyes getting involved in that robbery, right? And then all of the crazy stories that it moved
that
to,
spin out of it.
that
Yeah.
it spun out of it, right? Was so much fun, and really you pointed me towards that one. I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
Great. No, I've
great.
enjoyed both of your books, both yours and Christian's,
Yes.
and your work. And so it's great to see how these things all can spiral together
They
in a
do.
wonderful way.
Yeah.
And really giving a voice to people who traditionally have had no voice.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel Jane Chambers deserves a little, a little life after her death.
Definitely.
Some
Well,
200
it's
years
really
later.
been a
It
pleasure,
was lovely.
Serena. I
Thank you
wanted
so
to
much for
thank you for
having
joining
me.
us, and John for guest hosting.
Thanks, John.
I hope everyone's
Sure
enjoyed
enough.
the interview and joins us next time for the next interview in our series. So I really appreciate it to the both of you. Thank you. And keep up the good work, really.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
All
Great.
right.
thanks, Serena.
Take care.
Take
Thanks
care.
again. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
John. Thanks, Serena. Bye.
Okay.
All right. All right.
All right.
I'm gonna end the video and we'll post it and I'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good. Good to see
Thanks
you.
so much, John. I really appreciate it. That was great.
All right,
Thank you.
great. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye.
Bye.